Hi, welcome to Superhero Rundown. I'm Crimson, and today we'll be discussing why it's super problematic to have Gal Gadot be Wonder Woman. Now, before I begin, this is not about her acting chops. She makes a great actress who plays Wonder Woman. Linda Carter is also a great actress to play Wonder Woman, but there's a key difference between the two. One is Wonder Woman, and the other is okay with the genocide of an entire people. That's right. Gal Gadot, despite being cast as Wonder Woman, has been indoctrinated that the Palestinians aren't supposed to be there. But that's not the case. Before I go on, let me give you a brief history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm going to be as objective as I possibly can, and if you don't think I should be giving the Palestinians or the Israelis any context at all because it's all the way in the Middle East, congratulations, you're a racist. Now, sit the fuck down. The first thing to understand is that this is not a religious war. This is a conflict over land. So, the Ottoman Empire had control over Palestine in the 19th century. After World War I, the territory fell to the responsibility of the British. That was a bad idea. In 1915, the British promised Palestine to the ruler of Mecca if he led a revolt against the Ottomans, which the ruler did. In 1916, the British and French agreed to split up Palestine as well as other parts of the Middle East, and in 1917, the Balfour Declaration was established by the British government as a homeland for the Jewish people. In essence, the British promised Palestine to a ruler in the Middle East, the French, the Jewish people, and themselves. How are they going to try to solve this? Okay, after the First World War, the Brits established a colony in Palestine and also create separate institutions for the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian populations to make it easier for them to govern. Well, in 1936, the Palestinians revolted against them, but the Brits put it down pretty brutally. At least they called for a joint Arab and Jewish state within 10 years, right? No, because both the Arabs and the Jewish people are pissed. Arabs, because they have to wait 10 years for their own state, and the Jewish people because of limited immigration, because Hitler. So then Hitler starts World War II and loses. We do all know that happened, right? After the war, the British are going to handle the Palestine issue, right? Ha! They tell the United Nations, this is your fucking problem now. In November 1947, the UN decides to partition the territory like a jigsaw puzzle, because no one knows how to divide up the Holy Land. Finally, in 1948, war broke out. Israelis on one side, and Arab states and Palestinians on the other. Israel wins and ends up with a third more land than what they would have had under the 1947 partition. The Palestinians become stateless, and the Israelis mark this as the beginning of Israel. So everything's terrible, and things keep deteriorating between the two groups of people. In 1967, the Six-Day War happens in, get this, 6 fucking days. After the war, which Israel won, the Israelis now controlled the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. The UN passes Resolution 242, which was supposedly a framework for peace. Israel has to withdraw from those recent acquisitions, and everyone recognizes that Palestine and Israel have the right to exist as states. Israel then decides to establish Jewish settlements in Palestinian territory. Palestine cites this as illegal, which it is, but Israel's like, Palestine isn't a state, you guys, so it's fine. Spoilers, it's not fine. No. In the late 1980s, Palestinians boycotted goods and services from Israel and avoided paying taxes. Hamas also formed around this time and gained support very quickly because of its militancy and its dedication to social welfare projects in Gaza. In 1993, they tried to find a peaceful solution called the Oslo Accords, and then the Clinton talks, but no one could agree on everything, so things just kept getting progressively worse. People are dying. Hamas launches rocket attacks, Israel retaliates with extreme violence and invasion of Palestinian territory. Both parties claim to be responding to the provocation of the other. However, much of the conflict reflects a consistent failure on all sides to understand the legitimacy of the other's narrative. Palestine is upset because they still don't have a state when it was promised to them in 1936, and they basically live under a military occupation. Israel is pissed because they do need a homeland, and with that, they need to protect their nation's interests and protect against threats made against them. But, maybe you shouldn't respond to what you deem terrorism by committing genocide. Now, obviously, this glosses over a lot of detail, but for our purposes, it's a brief synopsis and background to explain how and why the casting of Gal Gadot is problematic. In A Foreign Policy for the State of Palestine, Jerome M. Siegel tells us, within the context of these harsh geopolitical realities, the foreign policy objectives of the State of Palestine may be identified as follows. Preventing draconian Israeli measures, including a mass expulsion of the Palestinian population from the West Bank. Preventing annexation of its territory by Israel and preventing reoccupation of its territory by Jordan. Bringing about Israeli troop withdrawal from both the West Bank and Gaza. Achieving some satisfaction of the rights of Palestinians dispossessed of their homes and lands in 1948. Establishing relations with Israel and Jordan that facilitate rapid economic development. And achieving long-term national security within recognized borders. Siegel wrote this in 1989, and it hasn't gotten better for Palestinians. The United States supports Israel, but that comes with being okay with genocide for some people? Oh, and don't speak out against Israel. That's political suicide in this country. And for those of you playing along at home, the United States is really fine with genocide and apartheid. South Africa had apartheid and the United States did nothing. Hitler tried to wipe out an entire people. The United States did nothing until the liberation of Europe. After those people had died. The Khmer Rouge wiped out Cambodians, and the United States did nothing. For more recent examples, the genocide of Myanmar, the ethnic cleansing of the Kashmir Valley, the situation in Tibet as it relates to China, the Saudis in Yemen, to name a few. This country has a history of being okay with genocide and apartheid. And it isn't just abroad, it's also here. Native Americans and First Nations people are constantly erased. After they signed a treaty to protect the Black Hills area, the United States government ignored said treaty and took part of the land back to create a monument to white people. Mount Rushmore. And you guys were like, let's put the United States in charge of making a treaty between Palestine and Israel? Where does this leave us with Gal Gadot? Well, there's a lot to discuss here, but the good news is that it all boils down to the fact that she has been indoctrinated with the Israel Defense Force propaganda and is fine with genocide despite Wonder Woman not being okay with genocide by any respect. But let's give the film its due. Nerdy POC in a Medium post puts it best. Wonder Woman, for the most part, will be and is a win for women in Hollywood. Box office revenue predictions aside, the big-budget blockbuster is helmed by Patty Jenkins, crafted and brought to screens by women. That's a win. Its cast features multiple visible women of color as Amazons and men of color in the ranks of World War I. That's a win. But also, there's this. This isn't just about 2014. This is about the 69 years that Palestine has been ravaged. Palestine's women, children, and families have borne the brunt of death, destruction, and despair. When faced with questions surrounding her insensitive statements, she's left them unanswered and accusations of racism and Zionism unaddressed. You can't have somebody embody a character so completely if they don't believe in the character's values. It feels hollow. For example, let's look at a different character with a similar concept. Captain America. Chris Evans played the character for multiple films, but here's the difference. When Chris Evans sees hypocrisy, he calls it out. He has contests with Chris Pratt for charity. He calls out the president repeatedly. His Twitter feed is promoting his work and being Captain America. The man helped Betty White up the stairs for an award. Chris Evans embodies the ideals of Captain America. No amount of singing Imagine during a pandemic is helpful. If you're going to be Wonder Woman, be Wonder Woman. Don't do empty gestures when people are suffering and dying. What happened to not while innocent lives are lost? The problem is that Gadot paints a naive picture of service in the IDF, where giving back is benevolent rather than resulting in a complicity in criminal acts. It's erasure of how grave the occupation of Palestine really is. It's contrary to the courage, accountability, and responsibility to justice that Diana has demonstrated again and again. Diana is driven by the call to justice, but her actress turns her back to it. These core values of the character don't make an appearance in the actress's own beliefs. Wonder Woman, at her core, symbolizes truth. The truth which Gal Gadot adamantly denies, avoids, and erases. Truth knows that since 1948, the State of Israel has systematically displaced, massacred, and imprisoned vulnerable children and civilians at large, writes Nerdy POC. And that is the issue here. I'm not disparaging her acting. She's great as Wonder Woman. She looks great in the costume. But at the end of the day, she's complacent in the genocide of an entire people. And that's not what Wonder Woman stands for. Netanyahu's government had plans to annex more of Palestine on July 1st. The latest, described as a counterproposal by Mr. Netanyahu to the Trump administration's original conceptual map for possible annexation, shows Jewish enclaves deep in Palestinian-designated territory growing, presumably to appease right-wing settlers who objected to being marooned inside a potential Palestinian state, according to the New York Times. Each of the three top Israeli officials meeting with Berkowitz and Leith has a different view on how Israel should proceed, ranging from applying Israeli sovereignty to 30% of the West Bank, including all settlements in the Jordan Valley, as the Trump plan stipulates, doing so in a smaller amount of territory, or not taking any such step at the moment and focusing on regional normalization, says the Jerusalem Post. But they pushed it back for the time being. U.S. President Donald Trump has yet to weigh in on the matter, as he is currently occupied with domestic issues such as the coronavirus pandemic and ongoing protests across the country, among other concerns, explains the Jerusalem Post. And it's not like you couldn't support the Palestinians. I think that you could have a homeland for Israelis and a homeland for Palestinians, since the Brits took it from them, but the solution is out of reach. Not because the common people aren't willing to work together, but because of how militaristic the Israelis and the United States have become in defending Israel. Ilhan Omar, a representative from Minnesota, got into hot water in 2019 for what some deemed anti-Semitic remarks. After the Muslim Congress member tweeted Sunday night that American political leaders' support for Israel is all about the Benjamins, a political firestorm broke out over the question of whether the tweet was anti-Semitic. Omar apologized on Monday under pressure from the House Democratic leadership, who issued a unified statement condemning her comments, explains Zach Beauchamp in a Vox article. William Cummings in USA Today says Omar and Tlaib are the first Muslim women elected to Congress. Omar said she was concerned that because of their religion, a lot of our Jewish colleagues, a lot of our constituents, a lot of our allies, think that everything we say about Israel is anti-Semitic because we are Muslim. Part of the full quote that Ilhan said that night is this: "But it's almost as if every single time we say something, regardless of what it is we say, that is supposed to be about foreign policy or engagement or advocacy about ending oppression or the freeing of every human life and wanting dignity, we get to be labeled something, and that ends the discussion. Because we end up defending that, and nobody ever gets to have the broader debate of what is happening with Palestine. So for me, I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it's okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country. And I want to ask, why is it okay for me to talk about the influence of the NRA, of fossil fuel industries, or Big Pharma, and not talk about a powerful lobby?" And she's right, because Islamophobia has been rampant since 9/11. There are two related yet distinct kinds of anti-Semitism that have snuck into mainstream politics. One is associated with the left and twists legitimate criticisms of Israel into anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. On the mainstream right, meanwhile, political leaders and media figures blame a cabal of wealthy Jews for mass immigration and left-wing cultural politics in classic anti-Semitic fashion. Unfortunately for those involved, Omar didn't say anything anti-Semitic. She was stating that money is what motivates support for Israel. But apparently that was enough. The fact that Omar apologized under pressure and that Trump and McCarthy have never faced real consequences for their use of anti-Semitic tropes tells you everything you need to know about the politics of anti-Semitism in modern America. In Wonder Woman on Gaza, What Would Diana Do?, Keith Chow expounds on this concept. Speaking up for the Palestinians does not mean you are supporting Hamas or even are anti-Israel. It is just impossible to ignore the facts. In this so-called war, there are way more people dying on one side than the other, and most of the people dying are civilians. When you have hundreds of people, most of whom are women and children, dead, and hospitals and schools destroyed, no one is right. War is terrible and awful, not a spectator sport. Supporting one's country does not mean you have to also support what the country is doing, especially when so much death and destruction is the direct result of those actions. Wonder Woman is supposed to be an ambassador of peace. Of course, she's also an Amazon warrior who isn't afraid to take up the sword against evil, but Diana of Themyscira only goes to war for those who cannot fight for themselves. Gal Gadot isn't doing that. She isn't going to war for those who can't fight for themselves. She's sitting on the sidelines and supporting a defense force that has imprisoned Palestinians and kills them on a constant basis. There were countries who banned the film, like Lebanon as a major example. The most recent major confrontation was in 2006, when Israel sent ground troops across the border and launched airstrikes after 2 Israeli soldiers were killed and 3 were kidnapped. Around 1,000 Lebanese were killed in the violence. Lebanon bans the purchase of Israeli products, and its citizens are not allowed to travel there. We refuse to normalize relations with an enemy state, said Rania Masri, a member of the campaign to boycott supporters of Israel Lebanon. We are not talking about a political disagreement. We're talking about resistance against occupation, reports Zahraa Alkhalisi in Wonder Woman banned in Lebanon because lead actress is Israeli. They do that because it's how they fight an invading force. The Israeli Defense Force may be defending their right to exist, but killing innocent civilians in the name of conquest makes them indistinguishable from a terrorist organization. Now, I will say that she has had a lot more ridicule than most who play superheroes in film or television, but again, the Israeli Defense Force has committed war crimes against innocent Palestinian civilians. That's what I'm calling out, that she supports this. And this is not just a problem with Gal Gadot. There are Muslims who see the movie as problematic as well. In Wonder Woman and the Imperial Feminist, Sophia Siddiqui tells us, the 2017 film of Wonder Woman has been hailed in the media as being a masterpiece of subversive feminism, and congratulated for being an iconic feminist film. However, beneath the laser scenes and extensive choreography lie political and pro-military messages that the film slowly reveals to unsuspecting audiences, particularly about Western interventionism praised in the name of humanitarianism. Siddiqui continues, watching Wonder Woman's overt glorification of Western interventionism is grotesque, to say the least. Diana affirms, I will fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. I cannot stand by while innocent lives are lost, as she runs in to save the lives of civilians. The disturbing irony of Gadot being chosen to play the hero who will end all wars and bring peace to mankind when she has actively supported the destruction of Palestinian livelihoods is hard to miss. It is even more uncomfortable as her heroism has been hailed in the name of feminism. And though I'm not Muslim or from the Middle East, I can imagine how terrifying that prospect is. Siddiqui goes even farther. Western interventionism is constantly justified by placing the West as the saviors of the world. Wonder Woman similarly promotes Western military intervention dressed up as humanitarianism. The film is set at the end of the First World War, depicted as a confrontation between Britain and Germany. The British are presented as the defenders of humanity, whilst the Germans are portrayed as the villains. The German general Ludendorff, played by Danny Huston, plans to force the British to surrender by developing a gas to wipe out all civilians. He tests his gas on innocent villages. All this sounds disconcertingly familiar to anyone following Western media coverage that has been used to promote humanitarian intervention in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. And that's not okay. You can't just assume that all audiences are going to be okay with what you want to say. The problem here is that you can't tell Palestinians and other Middle Easterners that Gal Gadot should be Wonder Woman when she supports an army that is fine with murdering innocent people, including children. But getting back to the cinematic allegory, Gal Gadot, a settler colonist who did not just serve in the Israeli army, as any other adult in Israel must, except, of course, those brave souls who refused to do so, but actually cheered on her comrades in arms when they were slaughtering Palestinian women and children in Gaza. This particular Wonder Woman, Miss Gal Gadot, is no ordinary Israeli soldier. She is a fanatical warrior in the cause of the Zionist theft of Palestine and the uninhibited slaughter of Palestinians, Hamid Dabashi writes in Watching Wonder Woman in Gaza. Before anyone says anything in the comments that I won't be reading, I want to stress that this is nothing like Representative Ilhan Omar getting into trouble for anti-Israel sentiment. That was because of American politics supporting Israeli right to terrorize Palestinians and occupy their homes that she called out. She wasn't being anti-Semitic. She was being pro-humanity. She was calling out the hypocrisy that Israel enjoys because the United States defends their right to exist. I think Palestinian writer Ramin Azarkani put it best in her article, Why I'm Reluctantly Sitting Out Wonder Woman. Ironic that this movie, starring Gadot, a woman who served as a combat trainer for the Israeli Defense Forces, is being hailed as a triumph for humanity. Ironic that Gadot, who publicly stated her support for the IDF during some of its most controversial periods, seems to be personally against everything her character stands for. As a feminist, I'd love more than anything to be excited about this movie. But as a Palestinian, I can't set aside my identity for 2 hours and root for a character that now feels deeply compromised to me. Israel has repeatedly transgressed upon the rights of Palestinians as people, particularly in its actions towards the Gaza Strip. In the summer of 2014, as Israel launched an assault on Gaza that killed 1,500 civilians and wounded and displaced tens of thousands more, Gadot voiced her support for the IDF in a since-deleted post on her social media. And she defends Gadot to a degree. It's completely within her right to show support for her fellow Israelis, and I have no love for Hamas. What is problematic, however, is her stance that the IDF was justified in attacking Gaza because of Hamas's alleged use of human shields, an idea that was debunked by reputable human rights groups. In fact, while they also criticized Hamas, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International both reported on Israeli war crimes during the 2014 conflict, in which the IDF repeatedly targeted civilians in schools and hospitals. Most of the civilians killed were women and children, the same group of people Gadot claimed needed freeing. I can't speak to Palestinian experience, but Azarkani is right. Dabashi, for his part, explains the significance of Gaza. But Gaza is not just the largest open-air prison in which Israelis have incarcerated some 1.8 million human beings. Gaza is also the moral measure of our humanity at large. If you are utterly enjoying this particular Wonder Woman as a role model for your daughters in a theater near you and could not care less about a young Palestinian girl mourning her family in Gaza, whom the woman portraying your superhero helped kill, then all the power to you. You need not bother to know that in this film, Gal Gadot does not just personify Wonder Woman, but alas, Wonder Woman disappears into Gal Gadot. The time that Hollywood could shove its superheroes down the world's throat and perpetuate delusion of truth and purposeful lies is over. Today, the world talks, walks, defies, imagines, and stages back against Hollywood and its dysfunctional mythologies that try to normalize the colonial thieveries of reason and decency. It was a strategic blunder to cast a settler colonial officer as a superhero woman who cares about humanity. For when you thumb your nose at reality, reality thumbs its nose back at you. And it does so not by political manifesto, but in entirely and gloriously cinematic terms. And in case you're wondering why I'm quoting so many Palestinians, it's their voices that need to be heard. In The Betrayal of Wonder Woman, Omnia Ghassan explains, on the Israeli side, 1 woman and 1 child were killed, and none were injured. Of course, all deaths and injuries are tragic, but these numbers reveal the severe disparity in power and violence faced by Palestinians. Yet the character of Wonder Woman believes a war should be fought between equal forces, and that women and children should be the first to be protected. It's also important to keep in mind why Palestinians have resistance fighters in the first place. In Gaza, the entry and exit of all people and goods are tightly restricted. In fact, most exports are prohibited, making a healthy economy impossible and creating an unemployment rate that is highest in the world. At the same time, we are not allowed to import most construction materials and many vital medicines. I could go on, yet Gadot glibly ignores those facts. So I'm saying if you want to educate yourself on what's been happening to Palestinians, listen to Palestinians. Don't just believe the oppressor, Israel and the IDF in this case. And just to give you an idea of why it's important to listen to Palestinian voices, in Why So Many People Care That Wonder Woman is Israeli, Ruth Graham explains. Jewish and Israeli media outlets, meanwhile, have covered the movie with a sense of hometown swagger. A critic for Haaretz nodded in his review to those who would watch the film with national Israeli pride, and the foreword asked if Gadot is on her way to becoming the biggest Israeli superstar ever and a global feminist torch holder for decades to come. It isn't just a triumph for women that the new savior of the world is female, a writer for the Jewish Journal wrote. It is a triumph for the Jews. Although the new movie is set during World War I, Wonder Woman was created in 1941, and her first enemies were the Axis powers of World War II. So fighting Hitler, the journal said, is in the character's DNA. I liked the film. I hope 1984 is better. I had a few problems with the first movie, like Ares and his fucking mustache not disappearing whenever he wore the helmet, and that the plot was a little too cliche, but I cried the first time I saw it. I waited 76 years for a Wonder Woman movie. Of course I cried. I don't think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will end anytime soon until people understand that Palestinians don't want to be terrorized. But I do think listening to them is important. They want to live. They want to have jobs. They want things that you and I want. I'm using my platform to say that Gal Gadot is problematic. But if she could get past her indoctrination and her training in the IDF and listen to Palestinians, maybe, just maybe, she could actually become Wonder Woman. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. Imagine all the people, all of them, not just your people.